I want to thank you so much for your interest in Cardinal Newman, for our contrast, sagacity, and sanctity, Newman's idea of a university, what it is, and why it matters. It's something that we take very seriously at this university, that intersection of faith and reason, and how Newman illustrates, elucidates, and gets us thinking about the ideal university, that place where we have the pursuit of truth and we have the depth of engagement in our own journey with God, our own sanctification. This afternoon's proceedings, as you have before you, will have two presentations and then a panel discussion. We invite your engagement, we invite you to ask questions and to really join together as we pursue this idea of Newman's University, what it is and why it matters. I have the great pleasure now to introduce to you our own President, John Garvey, who will say a few words of welcome and set the stage for the afternoon's proceedings. Welcome.
Thank you, Father. This month, as you all know, we're celebrating the canonization of Cardinal Newman. Next month, we celebrate the 20th anniversary of something called the Application of Ex Corde Ecclesiae in the United States. It's a document that was drafted by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops to implement the Apostolic Constitution by nearly the same name about Catholic higher education. St. John Paul in 1990 published a document called Ex Corde Ecclesiae that provides general norms for fulfilling his vision for Catholic colleges and universities. And at the end of it are some general norms, the most important of which, Article 4, has this to say: in order not to endanger the Catholic identity of the university, the number of non-Catholic teachers should not be allowed to constitute a majority within the institution, which is and must remain Catholic. Application, a document drafted by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops over a period of 10 years, elaborated slightly on this point. It says, universities should strive to recruit and appoint Catholics as professors so that to the extent possible, those committed to the witness of the faith will constitute a majority of the faculty. The language is intended to indicate that it's not enough just to have a baptismal certificate. Faculty should be, as the document says, committed to the witness of the faith. These instructions in Ex Corde and in the application are the most important and controversial parts of the two documents. The critics of Article 4 have made three kinds of complaints. One is that the commitment to Catholic faith is inconsistent with academic freedom. An institution that believes in revealed truth, some say, inevitably tends to suppress teaching that contradicts it. Another is that the university that confines its hiring just to Catholics must perforce disqualify 3/4 of all potential faculty members. And schools that fish in a small pond like this will be less successful than those that consider all candidates equally. Think how inferior was the quality of professional basketball when teams recruited only white players. A third criticism is that the insistence on hiring Catholics doesn't make equal sense in all fields. It may be appropriate to ask about a teacher's faith if you're hiring a theologian, but what is the point of such a requirement when you're hiring mechanical engineers or mathematicians? Cardinal Newman was particularly interested in this third point. He would have said that the teacher's faith matters for all his students because the teacher's job is not just to convey information, it's to dispose them, as he said, to an attitude of docility and reverential obedience to the Word of God. Newman, as you know better than I, started his professional career as a tutor, one of 4 at Oriel College, Oxford. In theory, each of these tutors was responsible for 1/4 of the college's student body. In practice, though, the tutors divided up the prescribed subjects among themselves and gave lectures to all students in the college and left it at that. Newman judged that this was a dereliction of his vocation as both a priest at that time in the Church of England and a tutor. Here's what he writes in one of his letters. I think the tutors see too little of the men, and there is not enough of direct religious instruction. It is my wish to consider myself as a minister of Christ. Unless I find that opportunities occur of doing spiritual good to those over whom I'm placed, it'll become a great question whether I ought to continue in the tuition. The other tutors were of one mind with Newman, and they proposed increasing their responsibilities in the way that he suggested. The provost, a man named Edward Hawkins, objected to changing the settled way of doing things. In his view, a tutor's job, apart from giving lectures, was more disciplinary than pastoral. And in the end, Hawkins prevailed, and this was, as it happened, the end of Newman's job as a tutor. It was not, though, the end of his ambition to reform university education. More than 20 years later, he revived the project. In 1845, Sir Robert Peel proposed creating a secular, non-denominational Queen's University of Ireland as an alternative to Trinity College, which was Anglican. The proposal was meant to be conciliatory toward Catholics, who, as you might know, couldn't even sit in Parliament until 1829. But Rome and the Irish bishops preferred the idea of an actual Catholic university, not just a non-denominational one, along the lines of Louvain, which they knew best. And Newman was invited to become the rector, and when he accepted, he imagined, as he said, that the battle there will be what it was in Oxford 20 years ago. There was considerable skepticism about the project in Ireland. As a way of making the university better known, Newman began publishing something called the Catholic University Gazette, soon after becoming rector in 1854. It was a public relations strategy of sorts, kind of like my creating an office of marketing and communications. Newman hoped his essays would inspire confidence in the university, both its mission and its viability. And one of these essays on professors and tutors draws a contrast between the professorial system typical in Germany and France and the tutorial or collegiate system he had tried to improve at Oxford. The professorial system needed only large lecture halls where lectures could be given impersonally from teachers to students. The college, Newman's ideal for education, was a more humane setting, almost, he thought, an extension of the family home. It was, as he said, a place of residence for the university student who would there find himself under the guidance and instruction of superiors and tutors bound to attend to his personal interests, moral and intellectual. Newman, I have to say, saw distinct value in each system. The professorial system, he said, fulfills the strict idea of a university and is sufficient for its being. But it's not sufficient for its well-being. Colleges constitute the integrity of the university. Newman's ideal teacher didn't accomplish all his work through classroom lectures. Some things are better taught and learned from life than from books. The practice of virtue is one of them. Here is how he put it in one of his university lectures given during his time at St. Mary's and at Oxford. It is entitled Personal Influence, the Means of Propagating the Truth. Here's what Newman says. It is difficult to estimate the moral power which a single individual, trained to practice what he teaches, may acquire in his own circle. While the scriptures are thrown upon the world as if the common property of any who choose to appropriate them, he is, in fact, the legitimate interpreter of them, and none other, the inspired word being but a dead letter, except as transmitted from one mind to another. Demonstration and imitation work better than reading and reciting, partly because the practice of virtue is such a complex notion. They're also more persuasive. He says, one little deed done against natural inclination for God's sake, to brook an insult or to resign an advantage, has in it a power outbalancing all the dust and chaff of mere profession. Power might not be exactly the right word, maybe attraction would be better. Newman draws an analogy between virtue and beauty. Personal influence works its effects, he says, through the natural beauty and majesty of virtue, which is more or less felt by all, but the most abandoned. I do not say virtue in the abstract, virtue in a book. Men persuade themselves with little difficulty to scoff at principles, to ridicule books. It is holiness embodied in personal form, which they cannot steadily confront. The silent conduct of a conscientious man secures for him from beholders a feeling different in kind from any which is created by the mere versatile and garrulous reason. Cardinal Newman's ambition for the Catholic University of Ireland never succeeded in the end. He left in 1857 and returned to the Birmingham Oratory. Supporters had raised about £250,000 to get things started, but the school had trouble attracting students. And the Irish hierarchy, which held the foundation money as trustees, spent most of it defending Rome in 1859 in the Second Italian War of Independence. In the latter part of the 19th century, what was left of the university merged into University College Dublin. Newman's ideas, though, have proven more durable than his projects. I recall my own experience as a student at a university run by the Congregation of the Holy Cross. The RA on my floor my freshman year was a newly ordained priest of that order, and this was common practice in those days at schools run by Jesuits, Sisters of Mercy, and other religious orders. The priests and nuns on the faculty taught and lived among their students. In the best cases, they provided the kind of example of holiness that Newman hoped to offer at Oriel College. These days there aren't so many vocations to those orders. The job of teaching has devolved upon people like me, us. It's a mistake to imagine, though, that we've inherited only part of the job, giving lectures to our students like teachers in Newman's professorial system. There's another, more important aspect to our vocations as teachers. Newman anticipated by more than a century what Vatican II had to say about the role of the laity. Led by the Spirit of the Gospel, they may contribute to the sanctification of the world. By the witness of their life, resplendent in faith, hope, and charity, they must manifest Christ to others. I think that's our job as faculty of the Catholic University of America. Thank you all for your attending today.
Thank you very much, President Garvey, for setting the tone and stimulating our minds in reflection upon these wonderful words of Cardinal Newman. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Andrew Meszaros. One of the interesting things that many people may not know about him is that he is a Cleveland native. He completed his BA in Philosophy and Theology at Boston College, and then went on to do his two master's degrees, both at the University of Oxford and at the Catholic University of Leuven, where he later completed his doctorate in 2014. He then spent 1 year doing postdoctoral research at the University of Vienna before coming to Maynooth, where he currently teaches. His vast research interests include Trinity, Christology, Ecclesiology, 19th and 20th century Catholic theology, Nouvelle theology, and John Henry Newman. It is precisely his interest in John Henry Newman that led to the publication of his work, The Prophetic Church, History and Doctrinal Development in John Henry Newman and Yves Congar. We could think of no more fitting person to open this conference. Welcome, Dr. Meszaros.
Thank you very much for the very warm welcome. Thank you for coming. I have two disclaimers. One is, first of all, I'd like to pass these out. So the first disclaimer is, I hope I don't fall asleep because I'm jet lagged. The second is, because of the air on the plane, my throat's very dry, so I am trying to avoid a cough attack. If so, I might ask someone to continue reading, but we hope we won't get too far. So, I'm going to present the title of my paper, A Philosophical Habit of Mind, Newman and the University. The Victorian scholar, George Malcolm Young, claimed that if he could preserve only 2 books on education, they would be Aristotle's Ethics and Newman's idea of a university. He claimed that the rest might, with no loss to humanity, and possibly with some advantage, be pulped. In his letters, Newman reveals to us that this work of his was his most difficult to write. And of all the discourses on university education that Newman wrote, it was what later became the 5th that caused him the most anxiety and sleep loss. In that discourse, he was attempting to explain that the goal of a university education is the cultivation of the intellect. Seeking a second opinion, he asked an oratorian confrere of his to look at it. Confrere strongly criticized it on the grounds that it failed to attribute a religious end to university education. Upon confronting this criticism, Newman could only just picture the very same coming from the Irish Episcopate. They would say something like, "Here we've invited an eminent English churchman to establish a Catholic university here in Ireland over against the secular, non-denominational Queen's universities, or those godless colleges as they call them, the ones that exclude theology on principle. And he's telling us that the goal of this Catholic university is not religious but secular, not moral but intellectual." Newman's solution was to draft an introduction that would clarify his position so as to both appease the Irish bishops who brought him to Ireland and to stay true to his idea of a university, which was neither a seminary nor a finishing school, but a place for the communication and pursuit of universal knowledge for its own sake. In that introduction, he clarified that the direct end of a university is intellectual, the indirect end is religious, or the esse of the university is intellectual, the bene esse, or the integrity of the university, is religious. In what follows, I will treat both the direct and the indirect end of the university. I hope, however, to do more than simply present these ends of Newman's university. I will argue that the indirect end of the university, that is the moral and religious formation of the students, is not simply superadded to the direct intellectual end of the university, but is integral to that intellectual pursuit. To understand this intellectual goal of the university, it might be helpful to consider first what the ideal graduate of Newman's University does not look like. So 2 intellectual pitfalls. For Newman, any education that is unbalanced risks promoting 2 highly undesirable intellectual characteristics. The first is what he calls viewiness. Viewiness is essentially a kind of superficial knowledge about everything without connecting the dots between subject areas, without tracing what is known to higher causes or principles, and without any particular attention to the accuracy or detail. It's all breadth and no depth. The person who succumbs to viewiness is one who is full of views on all subjects of philosophy, on all matters of the day. A variation on viewiness reappears in Newman's address on university subjects, where Newman describes what he calls the inaccurate student. The inaccurate student is one who seems to know something about a great many things, but those things are flawed or superficial, and when tried, wanting, when pushed, found unstable. The inaccurate student is viewy insofar as he or she finds it hard to focus on one idea or to pay attention to details in reading. Those with an inaccurate mind might be pleasant in conversation and comment on a given topic with flair here and there, but due to intellectual sloth, they will lack consistency, steadiness, or perseverance. On a practical level, says Newman, among other things, they will not be able to make a telling speech, he writes, or to write a good letter. They cannot state an argument or a question, or give sensible and appropriate advice under difficulties. And such a juvenile habit, viewiness or inaccuracy, is exacerbated, observes Newman, by the 19th century's cultural obsession with periodic literature. The more frequently things have to be published, the more young people are demanded to offer a view on this, that, or the other. It promotes in them what Newman calls, quote, a reckless originality of thought, Victorian could not imagine a 24-hour news cycle, nor could he fathom how vacuous much of round-table discussions are on television. He doesn't yet know what Twitter is, or a meme is, or what is meant to be woke, but Newman nevertheless sees the danger posed to intellectual formation by the demands of a culture's voracious appetite for media. This obsession with having views on things is, according to Newman, and this is the first quote on your sheet, owing in great measure to the necessities of periodical literature now so much in request. Every quarter of a year, every month, every day, there must be a supply for the gratification of the public of new and luminous theories on the subjects of religion, foreign politics, home politics, civil economy, finance, trade, agriculture, immigration, and he actually gives, the list goes further in the original. The journalist lies under the stern obligation of extemporizing his lucid views, leading ideas, and nutshell truths for the breakfast table. Viewy or inaccurate persons cannot draw a connection between their opinions on a certain matter and the deeper principles on which they are based. They might not know what the principles are, or they may have none. They might be very certain about a given position, but fall flat when under sustained critique. And with secularism's sidelining of once respected institutions that provided a common framework of intellectual givens, these are things that we all used to agree on once long ago, taken for granted, the viewy persons are hopelessly thrown back on themselves to establish these principles. According to Newman, they can give no better guarantee for the philosophical truth of their principles than their popularity at the moment and their happy conformity and ethical character to the age which admires them. In other words, viewiness is beholden to a culture that constantly clamors for views and input and avails of a kind of pop philosophy that assures the reader or listener that what is being said is informed and thoughtful. In this context, viewiness goes hand in hand with inaccuracy. The demand for constant input means we have no time for, no stomach for, and consequently no capacity for attention to detail and nuance. Now, the opposite of viewiness for Newman is the second educational risk for a university, namely, bringing forth the man of one idea. The man of one idea, or man of one science, is one whose specialization or major becomes the sole vantage point for viewing reality. The major interest of the man of one idea becomes the interpretive key for everything. Its principles become the measure of all things. The principle might be anything. It might be all material being is made up of atoms, or a free market allocates goods and resources most efficiently, or we ought to pursue social justice. These might be true, but on their own, they become incredibly misleading. Persons of one idea are incapable of seeing reality from a different perspective. Whatever they say, though in its own place true, is, to quote Newman, quote, it's sure to become but a great bubble and to burst. More nefariously, when in discourse with those who don't have a wider perspective than them, they persuade the world of what is false by urging what is true. That is to say, the world is easily deceived by them, for what they say is not false and actually boasts of great success, usually corroborated by technological and medical progress whose impressiveness is its own justification. The man of one idea is also simply tedious, and in the long run, an incredibly boring conversation partner. I say in the long run because the astrophysicist might dazzle someone at table with all sorts of incredible information that would fascinate anyone who is at all curious about the universe. But over a long period of time, if this astrophysicist is a man of one idea, he will inevitably sound tired when confronted with different subject matters. The man of one idea and the viewing man are two types, two extremes, which Newman seeks to avoid. One seeks accuracy, but must avoid hyperspecialization. One seeks universal knowledge, but must avoid superficiality. It seems then that we are at risk of spreading the butter either too thin or too thick. I argue, however, that it's not Newman's main aim to spread the perfect amount of intellectual butter perfectly, evenly over the entire surface of knowable reality. It's not about the student knowing a medium amount of knowledge about all subjects. His solution is rather to develop a habit of mind he calls philosophical. It's a much more manageable goal, but one that only a university is particularly fit to pursue. So here in the next section is Newman's ideal, a philosophical habit of mind. For Newman, the university is a school of universal learning, and its end is to develop and perfect the intellect. The intellect is made for knowledge, and so university education is not simply to impart such knowledge, but to capacitate the intellect to acquire knowledge also in the future. To that end, one needs to develop a habit that capacitates one for learning in different situations when confronting different questions, when confronted with different kinds of evidence and different methods. Newman calls this a philosophical habit of mind. Let's break this down. We'll take the habit of mind first, and then the qualifier philosophical. Now, by considering his usage of habit of mind, we can infer some things about what Newman means by habit of mind. He uses it a lot throughout his entire corpus. It's not just in his work on the university. First, for Newman, a habit is essentially the same as Aristotelian virtue. It's a stable disposition that inclines the person to act in a certain way. An intellectual habit, or habit of mind, is for Newman a habit that disposes the mind to infer and judge in a certain way. Second, a habit of mind is dynamic in the sense that it moves the mind in a certain direction. That is to say, the habit disposes the mind to judge one way rather than another, and such successive judgments of one kind or another propels the mind forward in one direction. Hence, he speaks of a religious course of mind, or a secular course of mind. The word course is important. Third, habits of mind, like other habits, are not taught, but formed and cultivated over long periods of time. The student who goes off to university already has an intellectual habit, but it's the university's task to refine it or to calibrate it. Fourth, habits of mind entail regular belief of certain principles. A habit of mind disposes the individual to think this way or that way by virtue of some prior, deeply ingrained principles to which he or she assents. Sola scriptura, for example, is a principle of the Protestant habit of mind. And entailed in this fourth point is the fifth and obvious point, namely, that depending on the principles assented to, one begins to cultivate a certain kind of habit of mind. So Newman speaks not only of a Protestant, but all sorts of habits of mind, including a Christian habit of mind, a religious habit of mind, a secular habit of mind, and an experimental habit of mind, among others. Religious faith, for Newman, is a habit of mind, as is methodical doubt. One can have as well a despondent, or liberalistic, or skeptical habit of mind, for Newman. One's intellectual habits give the human person a horizon or a worldview according to particular principles and presuppositions. So if a habit of mind is an intellectual virtue, a stable disposition of the mind that inclines the person to think and judge in a certain way according to certain principles, which propels that person in a definite intellectual direction, then what is a philosophical habit of mind? It is, to put it simply, the acquired ability of interpreting and making judgments about reality as one complex but coherent whole, or, in Newman's words, the philosophical contemplation of the field of knowledge as a whole. Perhaps the most important philosophical presupposition underlying all of this is Newman's claim that reality is one. While more will be said about this philosophical principle below, what is important to note now is the correlate, namely, that the intellect cannot approach that one reality, that it can approach it not through an intuitive vision, but only piecemeal, and hence only through individual disciplines or branches of knowledge. And further, that these branches are not isolated and independent of one another, but form together a whole system, or a circle of knowledge. Excluding one branch is likely to lead to distortion, imbalance, and misrepresentation, either by omission or exaggeration of key perspectives. It's actually his inclusion and understanding of the role of philosophy, or what he calls the science of sciences, that gets to the crux of what he understands a university to be. Philosophy, for Newman, examines the scope and limits of each subject by relating them ultimately to one single coherent reality, or being, in its height, depth, length, and breadth. He writes of it the following, and this is the second quotation. The comprehension of the bearings of one science on another, and the use of each to each, and the location and limitation and adjustment and due appreciation of them all, one with another, this belongs, I conceive, to a sort of science distinct from all of them, and in some sense a science of sciences, which is my own conception of what is meant by philosophy, in this true sense of the word, and of a philosophical habit of mind, and which in these discourses I shall call by that name. The philosophical habit, then, is about seeing things as part of a whole system. He also calls it this form of universal knowledge. Rest assured, universal knowledge for Newman is not knowing everything about all things, but rather, and this is the third quotation, it's the power of viewing many things at once as one whole, or referring them severally to their own true place in the universal system, of understanding their respective values and determining their mutual dependence. If you know where a puzzle piece belongs in a puzzle, you have a better, more exact, and trustworthy idea of what is depicted on that individual piece. Such a power, Newman writes, and this is number 4, such a power is the result of a scientific formation of mind, is an acquired faculty of judgment, of clear-sightedness, of sagacity, of wisdom, of philosophical reach of mind, and of intellectual self-possession and repose. To achieve this, the university must provide a forum for the representatives of all the sciences. Number 5, though the students cannot pursue every subject which is open to them, they will be the gainers by living among those and under those who represent the whole circle. They learn to respect, to consult, to aid each other. He apprehends the great outlines of knowledge, the principles on which it rests, the scale of its parts, its lights and its shades, its great points and its little, as he otherwise cannot apprehend them. A habit of mind is formed, which lasts through life, of which the attributes are freedom, equitableness, calmness, moderation, and wisdom, or what in a former discourse I have ventured to call the philosophical habit. This, then, I would assign as the special fruit of the education furnished at a university. For Newman, different methods in different disciplines supply different habits of mind. The coexistence of different but non-contradictory habits of mind is crucial for understanding what Newman is seeking to cultivate at the university. The historian might be using moral proof and reasoning from antecedent probability. The geometer would reason more deductively. The English student might be developing a more liberal habit of mind. The engineering student a more experimental habit of mind. The challenge of the university is to develop a philosophical habit in all students, while letting the more particular intellectual habits flourish as well. The philosophically habituated knows that each method in its own sphere is good. He knows one method is not adequate to all inquiries. Now, in terms of the foundations, the philosophical foundations for a philosophical habit of mind. What is necessary to have a philosophical habit of mind? What do you have to assume? The word idea is significant in Newman's corpus. We can recall, for example, that in Newman's essay on the development of Christian doctrine, Christianity itself is an idea which, like other great ideas, such as democracy, Judaism, Gnosticism, and Protestantism, these are all ideas which develop in history. An idea for Newman is something that seizes the imagination and mobilizes people. For Newman, all institutions are animated by an idea. Idea, he says, are the life of institutions. If the leading idea of Christianity for Newman is the incarnation, what is the idea of a university for Newman? For Newman, the idea of a university, the idea that animates the institution, is unity. This idea, let's call it unity of knowledge, assumes a host of other presuppositions or more foundational principles, which Newman took for granted, even if many today don't. They are then, by implication, the necessary principles for developing a philosophical habit of mind. These would include, but are not limited to, and I have 7 here. 1, reality is intelligible. 2, the intellect is made for reality, or capable of knowledge. 3, truth does not contradict truth, because, number 4, there is a truth that transcends all truths, a being that transcends all beings, a foundational ground for all knowledge, that unifies it because it is the cause of it. 5, this first cause is author both of a reality that is intelligible and of human subjects who are intelligent. In other words, God underlies both reality on the one hand and the humans who come to know it on the other. For God is, in the words of one Newman commentator, the source and guarantor of universal knowledge and of its coherent, intelligible unity, the philosophical ground of knowledge. Number 6, God is also the divine author of our natures, including those laws governing how it is that our human nature comes to knowledge. That we reason one way in morals and another way in physics is under God's providence. Discursive proof here, moral proof there. It's as God has designed it. It's in the nature of things. And 7, that the world is under a providential course, pregnant with the meaning intended for it by its creator. The list could be filled out more, but this is simply an indication of all the principles involved and presupposed when we say that knowledge is one. Just as sola scriptura is one principle among many of the Protestant habit of mind, the philosophical habit of mind works according to its own principles. One who conducts theological investigations according to sola scriptura will arrive at radically different conclusions to one who does not. Similarly, one who works according to these enumerated principles of a philosophical habit will think, learn, and judge differently than one who does not. When confronted with the infinitely disparate kinds of phenomena, whether physical, emotional, cultural, the myriad of truths, biological, chemical, ethical, the one with the philosophical habit of mind is able to integrate them into one whole. He or she is able to see how one thing influences another thing, how one informs another, how apparently disparate things are able to coexist and cohere in a unified whole. The philosophically habituated is on the lookout for ways to harmonize truths of faith and reason. The philosophically habituated, when confronted with new knowledge, new information, new evidence, new discoveries, is able to appropriate that knowledge not passively, but actively, in such a way that he or she situates it coherently in a larger vision. When the political economist moves beyond an analysis of the market and the efficient allocation of goods, and begins talking about the substance of the pursuit of happiness, the intellectual radar of the philosophically habituated can go off. The philosophically habituated can tell at what point Richard Dawkins' biology stops being biology and trespasses into the philosophical. But being able to do so depends on drawing the student's attention to these key principles enumerated above. There is no doubt that Newman's man of philosophical habit, like Aristotle's perfect order, is an ideal and seems an unachievable aspiration. But this ought not to discourage the educator. What is essential to developing that habit is very achievable, though admittedly a work of a lifetime, and that has to begin sometime. What is essential is adhering to those fundamental philosophical principles enumerated above, and getting into the habit of viewing and investigating reality according to those principles. Now we turn to the indirect end of Newman's University, the moral and religious end. This is Newman's ideal, sagacity and sanctity. Newman's famous portrait of the gentleman has caused not a little consternation among readers of Newman. Newman's laudatio of the gentleman seems like a solid endorsement, and yet he's quite clear that the intellectual qualities of the refined gentleman can be used for ill. A philosophically habituated gentleman who does not take his moral and religious duties seriously can be dangerously crooked. And what is more, Newman is quite clear that intellectual training bears no relationship to moral improvement. None. And he repeats it again and again. For Newman, trying to tackle the giant moral deficits of human passion and pride with knowledge and reason is like quarrying granite with a razor or mooring a vessel with silk thread. For Newman, the university's direct end is the cultivation of the intellect. Its indirect end, however, includes attention to a holistic formation, moral and spiritual, of the human person. A Catholic university has the indirect end of serving the church in this way. Newman has the students matriculated not only into a university, but into a routine that cultivates self-discipline and virtue embodied in the college or residence hall. There's a wake time and a study time. He provides for the students spiritual discipline and edification by, on the one hand, timetabling in daily morning mass, and also scheduling notable speakers to preach at his university church. He provides for wholesome recreation by purchasing for the students a billiard table so that they don't have to frequent the more questionable, if not entirely debauched establishments for the same entertainment. Bishop Cullen was very opposed to the billiard table. Newman compromised and said, I'm going to buy the billiard table, but I won't allow any betting. And he thought he was strict. Academically, Newman's idea of the tutor is one who attends to the intellectual and moral development of about a dozen students. He or she is not simply an academic assistant, but is also a kind of resident assistant. The personal presence of such a tutor is key to the holistic formation of students because he or she embodies what Newman elsewhere describes as the organ which has ever been what nature prescribes in all education, namely, the personal presence of a teacher. It is the living voice, the breathing form, the expressive countenance which preaches, which catechizes. For Newman, something like pure distance learning and studying, at least as a norm, is unthinkable. The personal presence of the teacher is paramount, for it is only through personal contact that one can transmit key intangibles, like intellectual habits. By way of illustration, just recently, a professor of physics at Southeastern Louisiana University wrote an article with the indicative title, "The Traditional Lecture is Dead. I would know, I'm a professor," in which he argued that the traditional lecture, though serviceable for centuries, is now outdated, and that it would be better for a physics lecture to simply screen episodes of the 1980s show The Mechanical Universe and pause it if there were any questions. His justification is that the episodes are inevitably more engaging and interesting than a traditional lecture reading notes with the PowerPoint slides in the background on the same subject. This article, thankfully, garnered a response from a professor of virology at the University of Columbia, whose article bore another indicative title, which ran, "The Traditional Lecture is Not Dead. I would know, I'm a professor." In his response, the professor pushed back, saying he shows no videos in class, but rather talks to students about his knowledge of viruses that he's gained from over 30 years of research. His highly popular classes on viruses he attributes to his personal touch. In his words, "To walk around the room without notes, looking them in the eye, and muster all my passion and love for a field and send it their way." This teacher of virology highlights for us what Newman knew so well, namely, that instructors are not simply dispensers of information. If they were, then indeed, one could just read books, or better, watch videos to get the information. But books and videos do not teach intellectual virtue. Only an instructor can, by his or her example. In his university sermons, Newman enumerates some of those habits of mind which the Bible enjoins on any learner, of which a good instructor embodies. Earnestness and seriousness in seeking the truth, as well as modesty, patience, caution, fairness in discussion, the willingness to suspend judgment or be ignorant for a time, and the willingness to share the fruits of one's research and not be rivalrous about its dissemination. According to Newman, these qualities are not only learned from the tutor or professor, but also from one's peers. One not only learns, but observes how others learn, takes note of how others ask questions, and scrutinizes how others converse. The community, in a sense, learns and pursues this together inside and outside the classroom. The point, however, is that for Newman, the university is a place that can potentially cultivate both the intellectual life and the spiritual moral life. He wants his students to excel not only in sagacity, but also in sanctity. After the pattern of a medieval ideal, the university is to fit men for the world, while it trained them for another. And such fitness and training obviously requires something more than intellectual prowess. He wants, as he would have phrased it in a different context, clear heads and holy hearts. And this is number 6. I want the same roof to contain both the intellectual and moral discipline, writes Newman. Devotion is not sort of a finish given to the sciences, nor is science a sort of feather in the cap, if I may so express myself, an ornament and set off to devotion. I want the intellectual layman to be religious, and the devout ecclesiastic to be intellectual. If one reads Newman's sermons preached in the university church, one observes the following. There's about six sermons that he preached in the university church. And they all have the one thing in common, namely, that a university rector in those sermons is using the different liturgical feast days or the gospel passages of the day as occasions for reminding his students, or drilling into his students, that while it is indeed a privilege for the students to be studying and pursuing knowledge, this very knowledge will not get them any closer to holiness, and that it's much more important to be a saint than a scholar. Given this, however, we are at risk of an inaccurate, or at very least impoverished, view of what exactly a Catholic university is for Newman. Given what I have just said, it might be understood wrongly that all real universities are essentially the same, the academics are on a par, but the Catholic ones are better equipped for religious edification and the cultivation of moral virtue. Such a view, I argue, is impoverished. To the contrary, Catholic university makes a difference not only in the arena of extracurriculars of moral and religion, but also precisely within academics. And it's not because Catholic universities include theology and others don't, although this too is relevant. And it's not even the ease with which Catholic universities include, happily, theology, philosophy, and the other liberal arts. That's also true. But the question arises, nevertheless, what is the real difference a Catholic university makes? The difference a Catholic university makes, at least for Newman, I would argue, has to do with how the moral, existential, and personal development of the individual is related to his or her intellectual life. There is a link for Newman between who I am and what I know, between being and knowledge. We are knowing subjects who examine and are capable of knowing reality. But two of the most important and imposing aspects of the reality are, first, the cause of this reality, God, and second, myself, one creature among many who is very real, the most real to me. We arrive then at Newman's celebrated phrase from the Apologia, the two and two only luminous self-evident beings, myself and my Creator. One's knowledge of the world implies a spirituality or personal relationship with God. True philosophical knowledge for Newman terminates in a vital relationship, a real relationship with the ground of that knowledge. With respect to the habit of mind that pursues this knowledge, the difference a Catholic university makes is that it alone has the capacity to help students adhere to those first principles necessary for the cultivation of a philosophical habit of mind in a way that is not only notional, but also real, and I'll explain. The difference between the notional and the real lies in the latter's experiential depth and existential depth. Whereas the notional is abstract and hence accessible to all, the real is experiential. In principle, any university can claim a notional assent to these principles, in theory. And with them, a student can begin amassing knowledge with a philosophical habit. But my argument is this: it is a Catholic university that is in a privileged position to foster those experiences necessary for a real assent to the principles underlying a philosophical habit of mind. Let us briefly recall some of these principles. Namely, reality is knowable or intelligible, that this same reality is one, or in Newman's words, that all knowledge is a whole, and the separate sciences parts of one, that this reality has a first cause and a last one, that everything in this reality, including the intelligent subjects who make inquiry into it, is therefore connected to this first and final cause. A notional assent, for example, to the propositions that reality is one and that reality has a first cause, can be made based on metaphysical analysis. A student might intuit it, might believe it because he's been taught it, and finally, after some reading and thinking, he might own it notionally. Everything that is shares its existence with the source of all existence, or, in the celebrated words of Aquinas, with the ipsum esse subsistens. But a real assent to this looks quite different. The oneness of reality is not apprehended in an abstract way, whose extension is universal, but in an imaginative way, existential way that is personal. I am a finite being who is confronted in my conscience with being itself. It's not just about reality as such, but rather about this world which I inhabit. It's not just about the first cause, but rather about my God, the creator of heaven and earth, the creator of me, of my intellectual powers, and of the reality that he wants me to know. It's not just about the final cause, but rather about God's plan for me, for this world I inhabit, and for my brothers and sisters who inhabit it with me. It's not just about the intelligibility of being as such, but rather about this thing and that thing which confronts me, being knowable, and that I, as a knowing subject, have a duty to know it. The Catholic imagination in this regard is privileged. All might in principle be capable of understanding the connection, for example, between contingent being and self-subsistent being, but through a Catholic's faith in Jesus Christ, the Logos, the wisdom through whom all things were made, and who has become flesh, through faith in Christ, the Catholic is able to know and even experience in a whole new way this very same truth. The same philosophical principles can, for the Catholic, be adhered to through a vital religious imagination. At a Catholic university, a biology major who hears a lecture on genetics might also have just sung in chapel the words of Psalm 139. At a Catholic university, the architecture student can contemplate the story of the Tower of Babel and its consequences. And all the students, whether in physics or English literature, have the opportunity to cultivate a real apprehension of the world's finitude and fallenness, beginning with one's own self in an examination of conscience. What I'm arguing then is that the same components of a Catholic culture or ethos on campus, such as regularly available liturgy, spiritual direction and mentorship, opportunities for service and charity, living arrangements conducive to the development of virtue, and fruitful recreational activities, all of these components that are typically seen as responsible for the moral and spiritual development of students also imbue the academic pursuit of a university by cultivating a personal, real adhesion to a worldview of one with a philosophical habit of mind. To conclude then, what I have argued here is that what is distinctive about a Catholic university, according to Newman, is not the spiritual and moral resources that are sprinkled on top of an already complete intellectual formation. Rather, these spiritual and moral resources play an integral part in an academic excellence, in avoiding the pitfalls of viewiness and in the pursuit of a philosophical habit of mind. This is the case not simply because moral and spiritual development provides the concrete discipline necessary to pursue study and avoid the distractions which many young people are susceptible to, although they do provide that. Rather, the extracurricular moral and spiritual character formation that has Jesus Christ as its foundational point of reference fosters a vital, imaginative, or real assent to a worldview that is the prerequisite for practicing a philosophical habit. Perhaps that is why Newman's Catholic University of Ireland followed Louvain in taking as its logo the Sede Sapientiae. The university is a seat of wisdom. A Catholic university's students know that this wisdom has become flesh, and so they perceive, indeed they experience, an unprecedented connection between the invisible and the visible. For the community of Catholic scholars, the chasm between astrophysics and English literature is not so large if one knows that the far larger chasm between the created and uncreated has already been connected by wisdom itself. Thank you.